The night Belle Conley first led a frightened family through the bone-dry wash behind the church. She carried nothing but a shuttered lantern, a Bible she never opened, and a promise she intended to keep or die trying. It was the autumn of 1875, in the scrublands of West Texas, where the Llano Estacado bled into Broken Canyon country not far from the New Mexico line. The town of Redemption Creek was little more than a scattering of clapboard buildings, a mercantile, a livery, and a white-steepled church that Reverend Josiah Conley had built with his own hands a decade before, back when the war was still a fresh wound, and the whole territory smelled of gun smoke and unfinished business. Belle had come west with him as a young bride of 19, following a man 20 years her senior because he had kind eyes and a voice that made the psalms sound like promises instead of poetry. She had not known, when she married him, that she would spend her nights guiding strangers through arroyos under a sliver moon, praying the wind would not carry the sound of hoofbeats behind them. That particular night, the family she guided was named Freeman, though Elijah Freeman had told her once, quiet and wry, that he had chosen the name himself the day the war ended, because a man ought to be able to pick what he is called when everything else has been chosen for him his whole life. Elijah walked beside her with his wife Naomi and their 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl barely 5, both of them silent as stones because Belle had taught them, gently, that silence was a kind of armor out here. They were the 11th family Belle had guided along what she called, only in the privacy of her own mind, the trail. She did not have a grander name for it. There was no organization behind her, no committee, no funding beyond what she could scrape from egg money, and the coins she slipped from the collection plate when Josiah was not looking, though she suspected he knew and simply chose not to see. There was only Belle and the dark, and the people who needed to disappear into it. She had heard the horses before she saw them. 3 riders, moving fast along the ridge above the wash, torches unlit but voices carrying on the wind the way voices do in flat, dry country. Belle's stomach dropped the way it always did, a cold stone sinking through her chest, but she did not let her steps slow. "Down," she whispered, and the Freeman family folded into the brush beside a dry cottonwood without a sound. The little girl's hand clutched so tight in her mother's that Belle could see the whites of the child's knuckles even in the dark. The riders passed within 40 yards of them, close enough that Belle could hear the creak of saddle leather and smell the whiskey on somebody's breath carried on the breeze. She recognized the lead rider's voice, low and gravel-rough, calling out something about a runaway contract laborer worth $200 to whoever brought him back to the Rourke Ranch by sunup. Silas Rourke. The name alone was enough to make her blood run thin. The war had ended slavery on paper a decade before, but paper did not reach every corner of Texas, and men like Silas Rourke had found 100 crooked ways to keep the old arrangement breathing under new names. Debt peonage, they called it in the newspapers back east, when the newspapers bothered to notice at all. Contracts signed under duress or not signed at all. Children bound out as apprentices until they were grown men with families of their own, whole families held in place by threats, and by the simple, brutal fact that there was no one in 300 miles of hard country willing to stand against a man with money and a badge in his pocket. Belle Conley had decided, 2 years before, that she would be that someone, even if she had to do it in secret, even if it meant lying to half the town and most of her own congregation. She waited until the hoofbeats faded into the dark before she let out the breath she had been holding, and only then did she notice her hands were shaking. "We are almost there," she whispered to Naomi Freeman, and the woman nodded, though Belle suspected Naomi had heard that particular reassurance from white folks before and had learned not to trust it too quickly. But 3 hours later, as the sky over the canyon rim began to gray at its edges, Belle brought the family safely into the hollowed-out cellar beneath Hiram Combs's barn, where a rancher with a grudge against the Rourke family and a soft spot for children gave them water, blankets, and a promise that come nightfall, he would drive them another 30 miles north in a false-bottomed hay wagon. It was on her way back to Redemption Creek that morning, exhausted and filthy and aching in every joint, that Belle Conley first laid eyes on Timothy Keller, though neither of them could have known then what the sight of the other would come to mean. He was sitting outside the livery stable with his shirt off, and a bullet wound in his shoulder that had gone an ugly shade of red around the edges, gritting his teeth while old Doc Ambrose dug at it with a pair of tweezers that had clearly seen better decades. Belle noticed him the way anyone would notice a stranger bleeding in the street at 7 in the morning. But what made her slow her horse was the fact that he was not making a sound beyond the occasional hiss of breath through his teeth. And his eyes, when they found hers across the dusty road, held a kind of tired patience that reminded her, oddly, of her husband. "Ma'am," he said, nodding to her, as if being shot were no more remarkable than tipping a hat. "You are hurt," Belle said, because it seemed foolish to pretend otherwise. "I have been more hurt," he said. "This is just inconvenient." Doc Ambrose grunted something about needing more light and dragged the man's chair closer to the open stable door, and Belle, against every instinct that told her to go home and sleep for a week, found herself dismounting and asking if there was anything she could do to help. That was how Timothy Keller came into her life, not with thunder and lightning as the dime novels like to claim, but with a bullet wound from a dispute over cattle he had never intended to steal, and a look in his eye that told her he had seen enough of the world's cruelty to recognize it when it walked past him, even dressed in a preacher's black coat and calling itself righteous business. He had ridden into Redemption Creek 2 days before, part of a trail crew driving 300 head of longhorn cattle north to the railhead at Dodge City, when a dispute broke out between his outfit and a group of Rourke's hired men over grazing rights along the creek. Nobody quite agreed later on who had drawn first, but Timothy had taken a bullet through the meat of his shoulder for his trouble, and his trail boss, unwilling to lose more days than necessary, had left him behind with 2 weeks' wages and instructions to catch up if he could. He could not catch up, not for a while yet. And so Timothy Keller found himself stranded in a town he had never intended to stay in, nursing a wound that ached like the devil, with nothing to do but sit in the shade of the livery, and watch the dust rise and settle, while he decided what to do with a life that seemed to have stalled out from under him. He was 31 years old, a former Union cavalry scout who had spent the last 10 years drifting from one cattle outfit to another, because the war had left him with a restlessness he could not name and a brother buried in a Georgia field he had never gone back to visit. He was not a man who talked much about the war or about anything else that mattered to him, but there was a steadiness to him that Belle Conley noticed even in that first meeting, the way a woman notices the strength of a fence post when she is used to leaning on things that give way. She did not think of him again for 3 days, or told herself she did not, until Josiah mentioned over supper that the wounded cowboy at the livery had asked after work, since his money was running thin and Doc Ambrose had told him plainly that riding hard with a shoulder like that would tear it open again. "I told him he might find honest work here," Josiah said, spooning stew into his bowl with the particular contentment of a man who had never once doubted that God provided. "The church roof still needs mending, and Hiram Combs is short-handed with the branding coming up. Man says his name is Timothy Keller. Seemed decent enough." Belle said nothing, only nodded, and told herself the small flutter in her chest was nothing more than tiredness catching up with her at last. Josiah Conley was 52 years old that autumn, though the hard country and harder years had put more gray in his beard than his age alone accounted for. He had married Belle when she was 19 and full of the fierce idealism her Quaker parents back in Ohio had raised her on, idealism that had not dimmed in the 15 years since, though it had learned to move quietly in the dark, along dry washes and hidden trails. Josiah knew about the trail. He had known for 2 years, ever since the night Belle came home at dawn with mud on her hem, and would not say where she had been, and he had sat her down at the kitchen table and asked her, gently, to tell him the truth. She had expected him to forbid it. Instead, he had taken her hands across the table and told her that if the Lord had put her in a position to do good in a world so full of cruelty dressed up as law, then it would be a sin far greater than any lie to turn away from it. He asked only one thing of her, that she never tell him the details, the names, the routes, so that if the day ever came when men came asking, he could look them in the eye and swear before God he knew nothing, and mean it enough that even a lie detector could not catch him. It had worked mostly for 2 years. But Josiah's heart, weakened by a bout of yellow fever in his youth and worn thin by years of hard living, had begun giving him trouble that autumn in ways he kept from Belle as carefully as she kept her secrets from him. He would press a hand to his chest sometimes in the middle of a sermon, pause just a beat too long, and press on before anyone noticed. Belle noticed. She always noticed. But when she asked, he waved her off with the same gentle stubbornness he used on every hardship, telling her it was nothing, just his age catching up to him the way it did to every man eventually. Timothy Keller began working around the church 3 days after his shoulder wound was cleaned, at first because Josiah paid him a fair wage to patch the roof and mend the fence around the small graveyard behind the chapel, and later, without either of them quite deciding it, because he had nowhere else he particularly wanted to be. He was a careful worker, methodical in a way that suggested a man who had learned patience the hard way, and Belle found herself watching him from the kitchen window more often than she would have admitted to anyone. The way his shirt stuck to his back in the heat, the way he talked low and easy to the horses when he thought no one was listening. It was 3 weeks into his stay, on an evening thick with heat lightning on the horizon, that Timothy first learned what Belle Conley did in the dark. He had gone out to check on a mare that was due to foal, walking the long way around the church property, because his shoulder still ached too much for him to sleep, and he came upon Belle in the small clearing behind the chapel, kneeling beside a boy who could not have been older than 12, pressing a cloth soaked in creek water to a wound on the child's leg where a dog, or perhaps a whip, had torn the skin open. "Ma'am," Timothy said, low, so as not to startle either of them, though the boy startled anyway, scrambling backward with the particular terror of someone who has learned that grown men appearing suddenly in the dark rarely mean well. "It is all right, Samuel," Belle said quickly, her hand steady on the boy's shoulder even as her eyes found Timothy's over the boy's head, sharp and searching, trying to read whether this stranger was about to become a danger to everything she had built. "This is Mr. Keller. He is a friend." She said it before she had decided whether it was true, the way people sometimes speak a thing into being simply by needing it to be so. Timothy looked at the boy, at the wound, at the fear in Belle's eyes that she was trying so hard to keep out of her voice, and he understood in the space of a few seconds more than she had told him. "You are running him somewhere," Timothy said. Not a question. Belle's hand tightened on the boy's shoulder. "If you tell anyone what you have seen here, Mr. Keller, I do not know what will become of this child. I am asking you, as one human being to another, to forget you ever walked this way tonight." For a long moment, Timothy said nothing. The heat lightning flickered again on the horizon, silent and far off, illuminating for a heartbeat the sharp lines of Belle's face, the fierce protectiveness in the set of her jaw, and something in Timothy Keller, some old wound from the war he rarely let himself touch, cracked open. "I rode with a cavalry unit during the war," he said slowly. "We came through a plantation once, after Sherman's men had already been through, and there was a barn full of folks the owner had locked up rather than let them run to the Union lines, chained the doors shut and left them there when he fled. We got there 2 days too late for some of them." He paused, his jaw working. "I have never forgotten the sound a person makes when they realize help has finally come. I'm not going to be the reason nobody hears that sound tonight." Belle stared at him for a long moment, searching his face in the dim light, and whatever she saw there must have satisfied something in her, because her shoulders loosened by a fraction. "Can you ride with a wound like yours?" she asked. "I can ride with worse," Timothy said, and that was how it began. Over the following weeks, Timothy Keller became something Belle had never had before in her secret work. A partner who could shoulder some of the danger, who knew how to read a trail for signs of pursuit, who had learned in the war how to move a group of frightened people quietly through hostile country without losing a single one to panic or exhaustion. He taught her things she had never known to ask about: how to muffle a horse's hooves with rags soaked in mud, how to read the particular quality of silence that meant men were listening in the dark ahead, how to choose a campsite that could not be seen from the ridgeline above. She taught him things too, though she did not think of it as teaching at first. She taught him, simply by being who she was, that a person could carry grief and fear and still choose, night after night, to walk toward danger rather than away from it, because the alternative was to live with the knowledge that you could have helped and did not. Timothy had spent 10 years since the war believing that his restlessness was simply the shape of a man with no home left to return to. Watching Belle Conley kneel in the dirt to bind a stranger's wounds, watching her lie without flinching to protect people who owed her nothing but trust, he began to wonder if what he had been missing all those years was not a home at all, but a purpose worth the ache of staying still. They ran 3 more families through that autumn, guiding them along the trail Belle had built stone by stone over 2 years. The cellar under Hiram Combs's barn, a hidden spring in a box canyon 8 miles north, where a blind Comanche elder named Two Feathers, who had made peace with the settlers long before and asked nothing of them but to be left alone, allowed travelers to rest and water their horses in exchange for tobacco and news of the world beyond his canyon. From there, the trail wound up through broken country to a Quaker settlement just across the New Mexico line, where a community of families who shared Belle's own upbringing had quietly agreed, 3 years before, to take in anyone she sent them and ask no questions about where they had come from. Each journey brought its own dangers, and each journey brought Belle and Timothy closer together in the particular way that shared danger does, stripping away the polite distances people keep between themselves in daylight. There was a night in November when they had to lie flat in a dry creek bed for 2 hours, while a work patrol searched the brush not 50 yards away, Timothy's arm thrown protectively across Belle's back, his heart hammering against her shoulder blade, both of them aware of nothing in the world but the nearness of each other and the terrible fragility of the silence they were keeping. There was a night in December when a child ran a fever so high during the crossing that Belle sat up with him until dawn, and Timothy sat beside her the whole night through without a word, simply present, simply there, in a way that told her more about the kind of man he was than any speech could have. She began to notice things about herself that frightened her more than any slave catcher's gun. She began to notice the particular warmth of relief she felt when Timothy rode into the churchyard safe after a scouting trip. She began to notice that she thought of things to tell him during the long, dull hours of daylight when they could not be together, small observations she wanted to share, jokes she wanted to make, and she began to notice, with a guilt that curdled in her stomach, that these feelings were not the feelings of a woman toward a hired hand, or even toward a trusted friend. She was a married woman, and she loved her husband truly and deeply, in the settled way that 15 years of shared life produces, a love built of gratitude and habit and genuine respect. But what she felt when Timothy Keller looked at her across a campfire, some new and dangerous thing unfurling in her chest, was not that love. It was something else entirely, something she had no right to feel, and every intention of burying so deep it would never see daylight. She might have succeeded, too, if the winter had been kinder, and if Silas Rourke had been a less patient man. Rourke had lost 3 families to whatever underground network was operating in the hill country north of Redemption Creek, and each loss cost him money, reputation, and the particular fury of a man who believed the world owed him ownership of other human beings simply because he had once held paper claiming as much. He was not a stupid man, whatever else he was, and by the time the new year turned, he had begun to suspect that a pattern lay beneath the disappearances. Every escape happened within a week or two of Sunday service at the little white church in town, and every escape, upon close examination, seemed to trace a path that skirted just wide enough of the Combs ranch to suggest Hiram Combs knew more than he let on. He began watching the church. Quietly at first from a distance, the way a patient hunter watches a water hole. He noted who came and went. He noted that the Reverend's wife rode out alone with unusual frequency for a woman of her station, always with some innocent excuse, visiting the sick, delivering baked goods to outlying families, tending the small cemetery. He noted, too, the presence of a cowboy who had drifted into town months before with a bullet wound and never quite drifted back out, a man who spent a suspicious amount of time in the Reverend's company for someone with no particular reason to stay. It was late February when Rourke made his first direct move, riding into Redemption Creek on a Sunday morning with 4 of his men, ostensibly to attend service, though everyone in the congregation understood within minutes that he had not come for the sermon. He sat in the back pew through the whole service, his hat in his lap, his pale eyes moving over the congregation with the particular patience of a man cataloging faces, and when Josiah Conley finished his sermon and the congregation began to file out into the bright winter sunlight, Rourke made his way to the front of the church and extended a hand to the Reverend as though they were old friends. "Fine sermon, Reverend," Rourke said. "All that talk of mercy and deliverance. A man could get the wrong idea hearing words like that preached so passionate." "The Lord's word is the Lord's word, Mr. Rourke," Josiah said evenly, though Belle, standing a few feet away with her hand tight around her prayer book, could see the careful stillness in her husband's posture, the way he held himself like a man expecting a blow. "I preach what Scripture gives me. I do not season it to any particular taste." "No," Rourke said, smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes. "I do not suppose you would." His gaze slid past Josiah to find Belle, and something in his expression made her skin crawl, a predator's patient assessment. "Mrs. Conley, I hear you have been a great comfort to the sick and needy hereabouts, riding out at all hours, I am told, dedicated woman." "I do what my faith asks of me, Mr. Rourke," Belle said, keeping her voice as level as she could manage, though her heart was hammering. "I am sure you do," Rourke said. "I am sure you do." He put his hat back on, touched the brim to her in a gesture that felt more like a threat than a courtesy, and walked back to his horse without another word, his men falling in behind him. Timothy, standing near the church door where he had positioned himself without quite realizing why, watched Rourke ride away and felt the particular cold certainty settle in his stomach that the man knew, or at least suspected enough to start looking harder. He found Belle's eyes across the churchyard and saw the same knowledge reflected there. That night the 3 of them sat together in the parsonage kitchen, the lamp turned low, and discussed in careful whispers what needed to be done. "We stop," Josiah said. "For a month at least. Let his suspicion cool. He has nothing to prove, only guesses. If we give him no new evidence, he will move his attention elsewhere." "There is a family waiting at Two Feathers' Canyon right now," Belle said. "The Whitfields, 6 of them, Josiah, 2 children under 5. If we do not bring them through this week and Rourke's men find them there instead of us, what do you imagine happens to that old man for helping them?" Josiah's jaw tightened. He had never liked being reminded of the stakes in such plain terms, though he never once in 2 years tried to talk her out of continuing. "Then we do it carefully," he said finally. "One more crossing, and then we rest, truly rest until spring." Timothy spoke up then, his voice quiet but sure. "I will scout the route 2 full days ahead this time. If Rourke has men watching the trails, I will find them before they find us." Belle looked at him across the table, and something passed between them that Josiah, watching his wife's face with the particular attentiveness of a man who had spent 15 years learning to read every one of her expressions, did not miss. He said nothing of it that night. But later, lying awake beside her in the dark, listening to her breathing settle slowly into sleep, Josiah Conley allowed himself, for the first time, to wonder what would become of his wife's heart, and whether it had already begun traveling somewhere he could not follow. The crossing of the Whitfield family went as smoothly as any Belle had managed, thanks in large part to Timothy's careful scouting, which turned up two of Rourke's men watching the low pass north of Combs's ranch, forcing Belle and Timothy to take the family on a longer, harder route through a canyon system that added 6 hours to the journey, but kept them well clear of any watching eyes. They delivered all 6 Whitfields safely to the Quaker settlement, and Belle wept with relief when the family's youngest, a girl of 3, fell asleep in the arms of a Quaker woman named Patience Hartley, who promised to love her as her own. It was on the ride back in the gray hour before dawn, exhausted past the point of caution, that Belle finally said the thing she had been holding inside her chest for months. "I do not know how to stop feeling what I feel for you, Timothy," she said, her voice barely above the sound of the horse's hooves on the rocky trail. "I have prayed on it. I have asked God to take it from me because it is not right, and it frightens me more than Silas Rourke ever could. But it does not leave." Timothy was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Belle wondered if she had ruined something irreplaceable by speaking at all. "I have loved you since the night I found you kneeling over that boy with the torn leg," he said finally. "I did not let myself call it that for a long time. I told myself it was respect or gratitude or the plain fact that a man gets attached to the people he shares danger with. But it is love, Belle. It has been for months. And I know it is a wrongness I have no business feeling, you being another man's wife and a good man's wife at that. I have tried to bury it as deep as I know how." "We cannot," Belle said, and her voice broke on the word. "Whatever this is, we cannot let it become more than it already is. Josiah does not deserve that. The children we are trying to save do not deserve the danger it would bring if we let ourselves become careless with feeling." "I know," Timothy said. "I know it, Belle." They rode the rest of the way to Redemption Creek in silence, both of them carrying the particular ache of a truth spoken aloud and immediately set aside, and if either of them wept a little in the dark where the other could not see, neither ever admitted it. Spring came slow to the hill country that year, the mesquite budding out pale green against the red dirt, the creek running higher than it had in 3 seasons thanks to a wet winter. Rourke's suspicion, as Josiah had hoped, seemed to cool with the changing weather. He made no more direct visits to the church, though Belle noticed his men riding the roads around town more often than seemed natural, and she and Timothy kept their promise to Josiah, running no one through the trail for 6 full weeks. But suspicion, once planted, does not truly die. It only waits. In April, word reached Redemption Creek through the careful whisper network that connected sympathetic families across 3 counties that a group of 12 people, an extended family of freedmen who had been held for a decade in what amounted to slavery on a remote ranch 2 days' ride to the south, had managed to slip away in the confusion of a spring roundup and were making their way north, desperate, exhausted, with almost no supplies and no clear idea of where safety might lie. 12 people. More than Belle had ever attempted to move at once. Old grandparents, grown children, babies still at the breast. "It is too many," Josiah said when Belle told him, his face gray with worry that had nothing to do with slave catchers and everything to do with the particular tightness that had been building in his chest for weeks, a tightness he still had not told her about. 12 people cannot move quietly. You will need 3-4 trips at minimum, and every trip is another chance for Rourke's men to see something. "There is no time for 4 trips," Belle said. "They are already 3 days out, moving on foot, with children among them. If we do not bring them in together in one push, some of them will not survive the journey regardless of whether Rourke catches them." Timothy, who had come to the parsonage that evening on the pretext of discussing fence repairs, found himself drawn into the conversation the way he always was now, his opinion sought and valued in a way that still surprised him after a lifetime of being the man who followed orders rather than gave them. "We could do it," he said slowly, working through the geography in his mind. "If we split the group at the canyon, send the strongest walkers with me on the long route, while Belle takes the wagon with the very old and the very young on the shorter road through Combs's land. We converge at Two Feathers' Spring, rest there one night, and push through to the settlement together. It is dangerous, but it is possible." Josiah looked at his wife, at the fierce determination in her face that he had loved since she was 19 years old and had never once managed to talk her out of, and he made a decision that he would carry, unspoken, for the rest of the days God gave him. "I am coming with you," he said. "Josiah, no," Belle said immediately. "Your heart, my heart," Josiah said, "has carried me 52 years, Belle, and it will carry me through one more night's ride for the sake of 12 souls in need of deliverance. I did not build this church to hide behind its walls while my wife rides into danger alone. I have watched you do this work for 2 years, and I have prayed for you every single time, and I will not spend whatever years I have left wondering if I could have helped and chose safety instead." There was no arguing with him once his mind was set, as Belle knew from 15 years of marriage, and so it was decided. 3 of them would ride out to meet the 12 fleeing souls and bring them home to freedom, or die trying. They met the family 2 nights later in a dry wash 12 miles south of Redemption Creek, a ragged group of 12, ranging from a grandmother so frail she had to be carried on a litter fashioned from blankets and mesquite branches, to a baby of 8 months wrapped tight against her mother's chest. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus Tillman, wept openly when Belle appeared out of the dark with water and food, the particular collapse of a man who has been carrying more weight than any human being should have to carry, and has finally been allowed, for just a moment, to set it down. "We heard there was help to be found north," Marcus said, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion both. "We did not know if it was true or just a story folks tell to keep hoping." "It is true," Belle said, taking his hand in both of hers. "You are safe now, or you will be before this is through." The night that followed was the longest and hardest of Belle Conley's life. Splitting the group as Timothy had suggested, they moved in 2 lines through the broken country, Timothy leading 8 of the strongest walkers on the long route east to avoid a stretch of open ground where Rourke's patrols were known to ride, while Belle and Josiah took the wagon with the grandmother, 2 young mothers, their babies, and an elderly man too weak from an old injury to walk far, along the shorter but more exposed road that ran close to Combs's ranch. It was on this shorter road, 3 miles from the safety of the canyon spring, that they encountered Silas Rourke. He was not alone. 2 of his men rode with him, and all 3 carried rifles across their saddles, and when Rourke's horse blocked the narrow trail ahead of the wagon, Belle felt the whole world narrow down to the sound of her own heartbeat and the small, terrified sounds of the baby in the wagon bed behind her. "Well," Rourke said, and in the moonlight his smile looked like something carved rather than felt. "Reverend, Mrs. Conley, out awfully late for a charitable visit, are you not?" "We are taking medicine to a sick family, Mr. Rourke," Josiah said, his voice steady despite the way his hand had gone white-knuckled on the wagon's brake lever, "as is our Christian duty. Is that so?" Rourke's eyes moved past them to the wagon bed, where despite Belle's careful arrangement of blankets and supply crates, the shape of huddled bodies was unmistakable to anyone looking hard enough, and Rourke was looking very hard indeed. "Funny kind of medicine that comes with legs and a heartbeat. I have been chasing a runaway family for 3 days now, Reverend. 12 of them, if my information is correct. Seems like an awful coincidence, finding you out here in the middle of the night with a wagon full of something you do not want me to see." "There is nothing here that concerns you," Josiah said, and Belle heard, beneath the steadiness of his voice, the particular strain of a man whose heart was pounding too hard, too fast, in a chest that had been warning him for weeks that it could not sustain much more. Rourke swung down from his horse, slow and deliberate, the kind of movement meant to communicate that he had all the time in the world and none of the fear that gripped the people in front of him. "I am going to need to look in that wagon, Reverend. You can step aside easy, or we can make this difficult. Either way, I am looking." What happened next unfolded in the space of perhaps 30 seconds, though Belle would replay it in her mind for the rest of her life. Each fragment stretched thin with the particular clarity that only terror provides. Josiah stepped down from the wagon, positioning his body directly between Rourke and the wagon bed, and said, in a voice that carried more authority than Belle had ever heard from him, even from the pulpit, "You will have to go through me, Silas Rourke, and I promise you, before whatever God you claim to believe in, that I will not step aside while there is breath left in my body." Rourke's hand moved toward the pistol at his hip, and Belle's whole body went cold with a fear so absolute it felt like drowning. But before Rourke could draw, Josiah's face contorted suddenly with an entirely different kind of pain, one hand flying to his chest, his knees buckling beneath him even as he remained somehow, standing between the wagon and the danger, a wall built out of nothing but will and love. "Josiah!" Belle screamed, scrambling down from the wagon seat, and in the chaos of the moment, Rourke's men, startled by the sudden collapse of a man they had expected to threaten, not watch die, hesitated just long enough for a sound to reach them from the darkness beyond the trail, the unmistakable clatter of a dozen riders approaching at speed. It was Hiram Combs and 4 of his hired hands, alerted hours before by a rider Timothy had sent ahead the moment he suspected the shorter route might carry unexpected risk, arriving now with rifles drawn, and the particular fury of men who had watched their neighbors suffer under Rourke's schemes for too many years to stand by any longer. Rourke, no fool despite his cruelty, took one look at the odds now stacked against him and swung back onto his horse, calling to his men to fall back, disappearing into the dark with the particular cowardice of a bully who only ever picked fights he was certain of winning. But it was too late for Josiah Conley. Belle knelt in the dirt beside her husband, cradling his head in her lap, and watched the life go out of his eyes with a slowness that felt like the cruelest mercy God had ever offered, enough time for him to speak, not enough time for anything to be done to save him. "Belle," he whispered, and she leaned close to hear him over the ringing in her own ears. "The trail. Do not let it stop, promise me. Whatever happens to me, do not let it stop. Josiah, please do not. I have loved you every day since the day I married you," he said, his voice growing fainter. "And I have watched you become something braver than I ever managed to be. I am not sorry. I am not sorry for any of it. Promise me you will finish what we started." "I promise," Belle sobbed, and Josiah Conley smiled, the particular peaceful smile of a man who believed, absolutely and without doubt, that he was about to meet a God who would welcome him as a job well done. And then he was gone, his hand going slack in hers, the last of his breath leaving him beneath a sky full of indifferent stars. Hiram Combs and his men helped Belle load her husband's body into the wagon. Alongside the frightened family, they had risked everything to save, and it fell to Belle, in the worst hour of her life, to make a choice that would have broken a lesser woman entirely. She pressed on, guiding the wagon the final 3 miles to the canyon spring where Timothy waited with the other 8 refugees, because Josiah's last words to her had been a promise, and Belle Conley had never once, in 15 years of marriage, broken a promise to her husband. Timothy saw her face in the lantern light as she brought the wagon into the canyon, and he knew before she said a word that something terrible had happened. When she told him, her voice hollow with a grief too large yet to fully feel, he did not offer words, because there were none equal to the moment. He simply held her, there in the dark canyon with 12 frightened strangers and a dead man in the wagon bed, and let her weep against his chest for as long as she needed, while around them, the small group of refugees, sensing the weight of what had happened, kept a respectful, grieving silence of their own. They buried Josiah Conley 2 days later in the small cemetery behind the church he had built, the entire town turning out despite the danger of associating openly with the Conley family. Because whatever else Josiah had been, he had been a good and gentle man, and Redemption Creek had loved him for it even when they did not fully understand the secret life his wife had been living alongside her charity work. Marshal Wade Higgins, the lawman from the county seat who arrived 3 days after the burial to investigate rumors of gunfire and dead men on the roads, proved in the end to be a different sort of obstacle than either Belle or Timothy had feared. He was a weathered man of 50 who had served with the Union Army during the war and carried no particular love for men like Silas Rourke, and when he sat Belle down in her own parlor and asked her, plainly, to tell him what had truly happened on the road that night, she made a decision that would either save everything she had built or destroy it entirely. She told him the truth, all of it. The trail, the 2 years of secret work, the 12 people currently hidden across 3 separate safe houses waiting for the danger to pass, and her husband's death at the hands of a man who believed the end of slavery on paper, meant nothing so long as he could enforce the old order through fear, and false contracts in a corner of Texas too remote for anyone in Washington to notice or care. Marshal Higgins listened to all of it without interrupting, his weathered face giving away nothing, and when Belle finished, exhausted and certain she had just ended everything, he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "My own father was a slave in Kentucky before the war," he said finally. "I have spent 10 years watching men like Rourke twist the law into whatever shape lets them keep doing what they have always done, and I have spent 10 years with no authority reaching far enough to stop it. You have given me something today, Mrs. Conley, that I have needed for a long time, a witness willing to testify, a pattern of behavior I can take before a federal judge. What you have been doing is not a crime, whatever Rourke wants to call it. What Rourke has been doing is the crime, and I intend to see him answer for it, starting with what happened to your husband." It took another 6 weeks, through the heart of a Texas summer that seemed determined to test every remaining reserve of strength Belle possessed, for Marshal Higgins to build his case, gathering testimony from families across the county who had suffered under Rourke's schemes, documenting the fraudulent contracts he used to justify his captures, and finally riding out with a federal deputy and a warrant that would see Silas Rourke arrested and eventually sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison for peonage, kidnapping, and though it could never be proven to the standard the law required for murder, a contributing role in the death of Reverend Josiah Conley that the whole town knew to be true in their hearts even if a courtroom could not fully say so. Through those 6 weeks, Timothy Keller never left Belle's side, not out of any presumption about what her grief might eventually make room for, but simply because he could not imagine being anywhere else while she carried a burden that heavy. He helped her finish moving the 12 refugees safely to the Quaker settlement, the promise to Josiah fulfilled at last on a bright June morning when the last of the Tillman family crossed into New Mexico territory, and Belle Conley, standing on a ridge overlooking the valley, allowed herself to weep for her husband properly for the first time since the night he died, grief and relief tangled together in a way that left her hollowed out and, strangely, lighter than she had felt in months. 12 lives. Not counting the 11 who had come before, across 2 years of quiet, dangerous work. Belle Conley had done what she set out to do, what she had promised her dying husband she would finish, and standing on that ridge with the June sun warming her face, she felt, for the first time in a long while, that the promise was truly, completely kept. Timothy stood beside her on the ridge, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and neither of them spoke for a long while, watching the valley below where the last wagon carrying the Tillman family disappeared into the distance toward safety. "What will you do now?" Timothy asked finally. "The town will understand, I think, if you decide to leave. Start fresh somewhere no one knows what happened here." Belle considered the question seriously, turning it over the way she turned over every important decision, slowly and with care. "Josiah built that church with his own hands," she said. "I have thought, these past weeks, about leaving, about how much simpler it might be to go somewhere new and be only Belle, not the Reverend's widow, not the woman who runs from the law even while doing right by it. But I do not think I am meant to run from Redemption Creek. I think I am meant to stay and keep the church running and keep doing whatever good I am able to do there, because that is what Josiah would have wanted, and because it is who I have become." "That sounds like a woman who has already decided," Timothy said, a small smile touching his mouth for the first time in what felt like months. "It is," Belle admitted. "But I do not know what that means for you, Timothy. You came here on your way to somewhere else. You have no obligation to stay in a town that has brought you nothing but danger and grief." Timothy turned to face her fully then, and the look in his eyes was one Belle recognized, because it mirrored something that had been growing in her own chest for months, something she had tried, out of respect for Josiah, and for the vows she had kept faithfully for 15 years, to keep buried. "I have thought about leaving 100 times these past months," he said. "Every time I found some reason to stay another day, another week. I told myself it was the work, the danger, the good we were doing together. But I think I have known for a long while now that it was you, Belle. It has always been you. I do not know what is proper, given everything that has happened, given how recent your grief is. But I cannot ride away from Redemption Creek and pretend I do not love you, because it would be a lie. And I think we have had enough of lying for one lifetime, even the necessary kind." Belle felt tears rise in her eyes, not the sharp grief of the past weeks, but something softer, something that felt almost like relief at finally being allowed to feel what she had spent so long forbidding herself. "I loved my husband," she said quietly. "I want you to understand that clearly, Timothy, before anything else is said between us. What I felt for Josiah was real and good, and I do not regret one day of the 15 years I gave to that marriage." "I would never ask you to say otherwise," Timothy said. "I loved him too, in my own way. He was a better man than most I have known, and he saw something in me worth trusting when he had no particular reason to. I do not want to replace what you had with him. I only want to build something new, if you will let me, that honors what came before rather than erasing it." "It is too soon," Belle said, though her voice carried none of the certainty the words should have held. "Propriety would say I should mourn a full year at least before I let myself think of such things." "Then we will wait," Timothy said simply. "I am not a man in a hurry, Belle. I have loved you for months already without speaking a word of it. I can love you a while longer in patience, if that is what you need. I only wanted you to know the truth of my heart, so that you would not spend the waiting wondering whether it was real." They did not marry that summer, nor that autumn. Belle observed the full mourning period that propriety and her own heart demanded, dressed in unrelieved black for the first 6 months, and gradually easing into gray and lavender as the year wore on, tending her husband's grave with the same careful devotion she had shown him in life, preaching, when the congregation asked her to fill the pulpit, until a new minister could be found, sermons that surprised the whole town with their quiet strength and clear-eyed compassion. Timothy stayed in Redemption Creek through all of it, taking on work at Hiram Combs's ranch and later buying a small parcel of land just outside town, with the last of his cattle-driving wages, building a modest house with his own hands, the way Josiah had once built the church. And though he and Belle saw each other often at church, at town gatherings, in the quiet visits he paid to discuss the ongoing needs of families still occasionally seeking safe passage through the trail that Belle had, with Marshall Higgins's now open blessing, transformed from a desperate secret into a quietly acknowledged mission of the church itself, they kept a careful, respectful distance from anything that might be mistaken for impropriety. The trail itself changed in those months, becoming something closer to what Belle had always hoped it might become. Not a fugitive operation hiding from an indifferent law, but a recognized effort, supported now by Marshall Higgins, and a handful of sympathetic ranchers and townsfolk, to help families still trapped in the illegal peonage arrangements that persisted in pockets of remote Texas long after the war had supposedly ended such things everywhere. Belle continued to guide those who needed guiding, though less often now, and less alone, since Marshal Higgins's attention had made the roads safer and Rourke's arrest had scattered what remained of his network of enforcers. It was on the first anniversary of Josiah's death, standing together at his graveside on a cool April morning with wildflowers blooming across the cemetery in a way that felt, to Belle, like a kind of blessing, that Timothy finally asked the question he had been carrying in patient silence for a full year. "I know this day belongs to him," Timothy said, standing a respectful distance from her at the grave, his hat in his hands. "I would not dishonor his memory by asking this on any other day, but it feels right somehow to ask it here, with him as witness. Belle Conley, I have loved you through a year of patient waiting, and I do not think that love is going anywhere, whether we marry or not. But I am asking you now, with all the respect I have for the man buried here and all the love I have for the woman standing beside me, if you would consider becoming my wife." Belle looked down at Josiah's headstone, simple gray granite with his name and the years of his life carved into it, and beneath that, at her own request, the words he had spoken to her so often from the pulpit. "Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." "I think," she said slowly, "that Josiah would tell us both that love given honestly and grief honored properly are not enemies of each other. I think he would tell us that a year is a respectful mourning, and that holding onto sorrow past its season serves no one, least of all the dead, who only ever wanted the living to keep living well." She turned to face Timothy fully, her eyes bright with tears that were, for once, entirely happy ones. "Yes, Timothy Keller, I will marry you. I have known my answer for a long while now. I was only waiting for the right moment to give it." They married in June, in the church Josiah had built, with Marshal Higgins standing as witness and half the town in attendance, including Hiram Combs, who gave the bride away in the absence of any living family, and old Two Feathers, who traveled from his canyon specially for the occasion and pressed a small carved wooden bird into Belle's hands as a wedding gift, telling her through the interpreter that it was a symbol of safe journeys in his people's tradition. "Fitting," he said, for a woman who had spent so many nights leading others safely home. The new minister, a young man named Reverend Amos Whitfield, who had taken over the church's daily duties the previous autumn, but who deferred always, to Belle's deeper knowledge of the congregation and its needs, performed the ceremony with evident joy, remarking in his brief homily that he had rarely seen a love story that honored the past so completely while still reaching, with open hands, toward the future. Belle Conley became Belle Keller that June afternoon, though the town continued, for years afterward, to speak of her sometimes as the Reverend's widow who had run the trail that saved a dozen lives, a title she wore with quiet pride even as she built an entirely new life, alongside the man who had stood beside her through the worst of it, and asked for nothing but the chance to keep standing there. Their first child, a son they named Josiah Elijah Keller in honor of two men who had shaped Belle's life so profoundly, was born the following spring, arriving loud and healthy on a night when a late storm rattled the windows of the small house Timothy had built with his own hands, a house that stood now not far from the church, close enough that Belle could walk to Sunday service in 10 minutes and still find time to tend the garden she had planted around her first husband's grave, a garden that bloomed every spring, with the particular wildflowers that grew nowhere else in the county quite so beautifully. A daughter followed 2 years later, a bright, curious girl they named Naomi Grace, after the woman Belle had guided through the wash on that first cold night so long ago, a fitting tribute to the family whose desperate courage had set Belle on the path that eventually led her to the love of her life. The trail itself continued for another 5 years, gradually needing less secrecy as federal enforcement of emancipation laws finally reached even the most remote corners of Texas, until the arrangements that had once made such danger necessary faded, slowly, into the shameful history of a country still learning what freedom truly required of those who claimed to believe in it. Belle kept records, careful and complete, of every family she had helped, 23 in total by the time the need for such secret work finally ended, a number that grew far beyond the dozen the town had first whispered about in awed, admiring tones, though Belle herself never counted the numbers the way others did. She counted faces. She counted the particular sound of relief in a mother's voice when she realized her children were finally, truly safe. Timothy Keller built a good life in Redemption Creek, expanding his small parcel of land into a modest but successful ranch, raising cattle and, in time, raising children who grew up hearing the story of how their parents had fallen in love in the dark, guiding strangers to safety. A story that became, in the retelling around countless family suppers over the years, less a tale of danger and more a tale of two people who had found each other because they both believed, in their bones, that doing right by a stranger was never truly a sacrifice, only ever an investment in the kind of world worth living in. Belle never stopped visiting Josiah's grave, tending the wildflowers, telling him, in the quiet way one talks to the dead when no one else is listening, about the children, about the church, about the particular joys and small sorrows of a life well lived. She did not believe this dishonored her second marriage in any way. She believed instead that love, real love, was large enough to hold more than one truth at once, that she had loved a good man deeply and completely, and that his death, terrible as it was, had opened a door to a second love equally deep, equally complete, built not on the ashes of the first but standing beside it, the way two trees can grow close together in the same soil and both flourish, roots intertwined, neither one diminished by the other's presence. When Belle Keller died, many years later, an old woman surrounded by grandchildren, and the particular piece of a life spent doing good in a hard world, the town of Redemption Creek buried her beside Josiah Conley, exactly as she had requested, with Timothy Keller, himself gray and stooped with age by then, standing at the graveside holding the hand of the woman he had loved for more than 4 decades, unable to feel anything but gratitude for every single one of those years, however they had begun. The little wooden bird that 2 feathers had given her as a wedding gift sat, for the rest of her life, on the mantel of the house Timothy built, a small carved thing worn smooth by decades of loving hands, and it passed down, eventually, to her children and grandchildren, a physical reminder of a story that Redemption Creek told for generations afterward, of the Reverend's wife who had run a secret trail through the dark canyons of West Texas, and the cowboy who had found, in helping her save a dozen lives and then a dozen more, the only home he had ever truly needed. The church still stood, decades later, its white steeple a little more weathered, its congregation grown and changed with the passing years. But the story of Belle Conley and Timothy Keller remained woven into its history the way the finest stories always do, not as legend exaggerated beyond recognition, but as simple, sturdy truth. That in a hard and unjust time, 2 people had chosen courage over safety, love over fear, and had built, out of danger and grief and stubborn hope, a life together worth every single risk it had cost them to find it.